In the warm, golden glow of the early morning sun, the Nile River stretched out before the bustling city of Thebes, winding through the lands like a lifeline to the ancient Egyptian civilization. The city was a melting pot of life, full of merchants, scribes, priests, and the sounds of distant construction as Egypt's grandeur continued to grow. Yet, in the royal palace, away from the noise and chaos of the streets, a young girl named Nefret found her world confined to the luxuriously adorned walls of the palace. Nefret was born into a family with noble blood, though not directly royal. Her father, a respected vizier, served under pharaohs from the first intermediate period, a time when Egypt was divided, weak, and vulnerable. Growing up in his shadow, Nefret quickly learned the subtleties of politics and diplomacy, the importance of keeping one's mind sharp and one's tongue sharper. Her mother, a woman of grace and strength, ensured that Nefret was not just a product of nobility, but someone who understood the burdens of leadership. By the age of 16, Nefret was already admired for her beauty, intelligence, and poise, yet it was her sharp mind and calculated ambition that set her apart from other noble women. While most were content with their roles in their father's houses, Nefret's heart yearned for something more. She had heard the stories of powerful women in Egypt's past, of queens who had ruled beside their kings, their influence stretching far beyond the palace walls. Little did Nefret know, her destiny was about to intertwine with one of the most important figures in Egypt's history. One crisp evening, when the sky painted itself with the deep purples and reds of dusk, Nefret's father received a royal summons. The message was brief but urgent. Pharaoh Amenemhat I requests the presence of the noble house of the vizier. Her father, whose wisdom and counsel had reached the ears of the new pharaoh, smiled knowingly. The rise of Amenemhat I had been swift and calculated, and rumors of his strategic brilliance were already spreading through the court. He had united Upper and Lower Egypt once again, but his reign, although successful, had yet to be fully solidified. And for that, the young pharaoh needed alliances through marriage. Nefret, though she had never imagined herself in such a position, found herself being prepared for a union with the powerful pharaoh. The moment she stepped into the royal court, she felt the weight of the expectations placed upon her. And yet, she also sensed something else. It was the thrill of possibility, the chance to step into a world where her intellect could be valued, and her influence, one day, could stretch across the empire. The pharaoh's court was a place of opulence and danger, a space where lives were shaped and shattered in the blink of an eye. It was there that Nefret met Amenemhat I for the first time. Amenemhat I was not the young, brash ruler that many expected. His eyes, though sharp and calculating, were tempered by years of military experience and a deep understanding of the political machinations that often ran under the surface of the grandiose titles and court rituals. There was a quiet strength about him that Nefret immediately recognized. He was not a man to be swayed by outward appearances or fleeting power. He valued loyalty and wisdom above all else, qualities that he had spent years cultivating in the shadows before claiming the throne. As Nefret and Amenemhat I exchanged their first words, Nefret felt a flicker of something unexpected: respect. The pharaoh was not the arrogant, pompous leader she had anticipated. He asked her about her upbringing, her thoughts on governance, and even her opinion on matters of diplomacy. Their conversation, though brief, left Nefret with an impression that would linger far longer than she could have ever imagined. The following days saw Nefret's life take on an entirely new direction. She moved from the familiar halls of her father's home into the grandeur of the royal palace. Now officially betrothed to Pharaoh Amenemhat I, the court's atmosphere shifted. Where once there had been whispers of uncertain power, there was now a sense of stability. Amenemhat I had chosen Nefret not just for her beauty but for her sharpness, her ability to understand the intricacies of both royal politics and the burdens of leadership. In Nefret, he saw a partner, a woman who could help him govern with wisdom, not just authority. Nefret quickly adapted to her new role, though it was not without its challenges. The weight of expectations was immense. She had to navigate the complex social dynamics of the royal court, picking her allies carefully, learning the subtleties of the court's many factions, and, above all, proving herself worthy of Amenemhat I's trust. As time passed, Nefret became an integral part of Amenemhat I's inner circle. She accompanied him to council meetings, advised him on matters of diplomacy, and even sat in on discussions regarding the state of Egypt's military campaigns. The pharaoh began to lean on her advice more and more, sensing in her a wisdom and pragmatism that was rare for a woman of her age. Nefret had a quiet power about her, an understanding of how to wield influence. Even in a world that often saw women as mere accessories to their husbands' reigns. It was not long before she proved herself invaluable. When Amenemhat I faced challenges from rival factions in the court, noble families who sought to destabilize his rule, Nefret's intelligence and foresight played a crucial role in maintaining his authority. She navigated the tricky waters of court politics, ensuring that her family remained aligned with the pharaoh, even when others sought to tear them apart. By the time Nefret turned 20, she was no longer just the wife of Pharaoh Amenemhat I. She had become a force in her own right, a queen with a vision. One who saw not just her own future but the future of Egypt itself. As her influence grew, so did the stakes. The road ahead would not be without its dangers. And Nefret knew that every decision she made could change the course of history. But for now, she stood beside her husband, the Pharaoh of Egypt, at the dawn of a new era. And in the quiet moments between them, when the weight of the crown did not press so heavily on their shoulders, Nefret knew that this was just the beginning of a journey far greater than she had ever dreamed. The day had finally come. The grand hall of the royal palace stood silent as the sun cast its first golden rays across the kingdom of Egypt. The citizens, from the humblest farmer to the most respected noble, gathered along the banks of the Nile, eager to witness a momentous event, Pharaoh Amenemhat I's coronation. His reign, though short, had already been one of remarkable accomplishments, uniting the upper and lower kingdoms of Egypt after a period of turmoil. But now, with his wife Nefret by his side, the question of his legacy began to take shape. Nefret stood beside her husband in the ceremonial chamber, her face calm yet focused, as the high priests performed the ancient rituals to solidify Amenemhat I's reign. The air was thick with incense, and the chants of the priests echoed through the hall, their voices rising in unison as the pharaoh prepared to accept the mantle of rule. The ancient symbols of the gods were presented to him, Ankh, Djed, and Was, all symbols of life, stability, and power. Yet, in the midst of this sacred ceremony, Nefret knew that the challenges that lay ahead would not be solved by rituals alone. Her gaze swept across the gathered court, each noble and advisor presenting their smiles and pledges of loyalty. But beneath the surface, she could sense the growing tensions. The path to true power was rarely smooth, and Amenemhat I's rule had yet to fully take root. Rivals from within the court still whispered of old alliances and shifting loyalties. Egypt, for all its grandeur, remained a land of constant political maneuvering. As the final ritual drew to a close, Amenemhat I was crowned pharaoh. The crown, heavy with the weight of centuries of rulers, was placed upon his head. His posture was proud, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. The eyes of the court turned toward him, awaiting his first words as king. His gaze, though, lingered on Nefret, who stood next to him, her presence an anchor to the weight of the moment. When Amenemhat I spoke, his voice was firm, a powerful declaration to those who had gathered. "The gods have favored us with their blessing," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "But the true strength of this kingdom will not come from the throne alone. It will come from the unity of our people and the wisdom of those who stand beside me." Nefret's heart swelled with pride. The words were not just meant for the court, they were a message to the people of Egypt. A pledge of her husband's intention to rule not with tyranny but with foresight and collaboration. She had always known that his strength lay in his ability to unite, to see the long path ahead and lead Egypt to greatness. But now, she also understood that this would be their journey. Together, in the weeks that followed the coronation, the grand plans for Egypt's future began to take shape. Nefret's role was more significant than ever before. She was not just a wife, but a key advisor, her influence growing day by day. Amenemhat I leaned heavily on her wisdom, recognizing that her understanding of both the politics of the court and the hearts of the people made her indispensable. They moved swiftly to solidify their control over Egypt, making strategic decisions that would lay the foundation for a unified and prosperous nation. One of the first acts of Amenemhat I's reign was the reform of Egypt's administration. And Nefret was instrumental in guiding her husband's decisions on how to delegate power effectively. She advised him on the importance of maintaining the balance between the powerful military and the influential priesthood, both of which could tip the scales of power in the kingdom. But it was not just administrative matters that Nefret handled. She found herself deeply involved in matters of statecraft, often sitting at the table with the most seasoned generals, scribes, and high-ranking officials. It was there, in these chambers filled with heated discussions, that Nefret began to demonstrate the full extent of her intellect. She didn't just offer suggestions, she shaped policies. She recommended strengthening Egypt's fortifications, particularly along the borders, and stressed the need to support the agricultural sectors, ensuring that Egypt's economy remained stable and self-sufficient. In every conversation, Nefret made her mark. Her words were measured, never hasty, yet always impactful. Her ability to see the long-term consequences of every decision, whether military, political, or economic, impressed those around her. The court had initially been skeptical of the queen's involvement in these matters, but her counsel was now sought after and valued by many of Amenemhat I's closest advisors. However, not all were pleased by Nefret's growing influence. In the shadows of the royal palace, whispers began to spread. Some nobles, particularly those who had supported Amenemhat I's rise to power for personal gain, began to view Nefret's role with suspicion. She was a woman, and many in the court still saw her as a figurehead, a mere accessory to her husband's reign. But Nefret understood the ways of the court, and she knew that her influence could be a double-edged sword. She had earned her place, and she would not allow anyone to diminish her role. One evening, a faction of disgruntled nobles gathered under the cover of darkness in a secluded corner of the palace. They spoke of the queen's increasing involvement in matters of governance, of her subtle manipulation of her husband's decisions. They saw her as a threat, an obstacle to their ambitions. And so, they began to plot, quietly laying the groundwork for a plan to undermine her influence. But Nefret, ever astute, was not blind to these growing tensions. She had eyes and ears throughout the palace, and it wasn't long before she learned of the conspiracy brewing against her. Rather than acting rashly, she chose to bide her time, knowing that the right moment would come when she could turn the tables. In the meantime, Egypt's enemies were stirring at the borders. The growing strength of the Hyksos in the north had begun to pose a significant threat to the stability of the kingdom. Amenemhat I knew that securing Egypt's borders would be crucial for his reign. But he also understood that he could not do it alone. Once again, it was Nefret who came to his aid, urging him to strengthen alliances with neighboring kingdoms and to consolidate Egypt's military forces. Together, they began the process of fortifying Egypt's northern defenses, ensuring that the kingdom's resources were properly allocated. It was a difficult and expensive endeavor, but one that would ultimately safeguard Egypt from external threats. Nefret's keen understanding of both diplomacy and military strategy allowed her to help her husband navigate this complex situation with grace. The days grew long and the burdens heavier. But Nefret stood steadfast beside her husband. It was not just her intelligence that made her indispensable, it was her unwavering loyalty and determination to see Egypt thrive. And as Amenemhat I's reign solidified, so too did the power of the woman beside him. In the shadows of the royal court, Nefret's influence was felt far and wide, and the foundation was being laid for a new Egypt, a unified, prosperous land that would stand the test of time. Yet, as they pressed forward with their plans for Egypt's future, Nefret knew that the road ahead would not be without its challenges. She had proven herself capable, but the true test of her power was yet to come. There would be betrayals, both within the court and beyond. But as the Queen of Egypt, Nefret was prepared to face whatever dangers lay ahead, knowing that her legacy, and that of her husband, would one day be immortalized in the annals of history. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting a soft, golden light across the royal palace. The air was thick with anticipation, the usual quiet hum of the palace now filled with an unspoken urgency. Inside the palace's inner chambers, Nefret lay on her bed, surrounded by attendants and midwives. As the weight of expectation pressed heavily upon her, the birth of a royal heir was more than just a personal moment. It was a pivotal moment in Egypt's history. The fate of the kingdom, the strength of Amenemhat I's dynasty, rested upon the child she was about to bring into the world. Though her heart raced with the intensity of the moment, Nefret's mind remained focused. She had always known the weight of leadership. But today it was different. Today, she would give the kingdom its future. As the hours dragged on, Nefret's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought back to the days of her youth, when her father's wisdom had first planted the seed of ambition in her heart. She had never envisioned herself in the role she now occupied, standing beside one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs. Yet, it was here, in this royal chamber, that her true purpose had crystallized. She was not just the wife of Pharaoh Amenemhat I, she was the mother of Egypt's future. The cries of a newborn broke through her thoughts. And for a moment, the room fell silent. Nefret's heart swelled with emotion as the midwife placed the infant in her arms. There, in her hands, was the heir to the throne, her son, Senusret I, the boy who would one day inherit his father's crown and, with it, the hopes of an entire kingdom. Gazed up at his mother with wide, curious eyes. His tiny fingers grasped at the air, and Nefret smiled softly, her heart overwhelmed with love and a sense of duty. She held him close, knowing that this child would one day be the leader who would carry forward the legacy of Amenemhat I's reign. From the moment Senusret was born, Nefret knew that she would do everything in her power to ensure his success. She had always known that ruling Egypt would require more than just strength, it required intelligence, wisdom, and the ability to command loyalty. And Senusret, with his calm demeanor and piercing gaze, already possessed the qualities of a great leader. As the days passed, Nefret found herself immersed in the delicate balance between motherhood and statecraft. While her son was still an infant, she began to plan for the future. She knew that her role in shaping Senusret's reign was just as crucial as her role beside Amenemhat I. It would be her guidance, her wisdom, and her understanding of the world that would prepare him to rule. It wasn't long before Senusret's birth became a symbol of hope for Egypt. The people, weary from years of division and unrest, saw in the newborn prince a new era. His birth marked the continuation of Amenemhat I's dynasty, and with it, the promise of stability, prosperity, and peace. The priests performed rituals to honor the boy, declaring that the gods had favored Egypt with a new king, a king who would restore Egypt to its former glory. For Nefret, however, the birth of her son was more than just a symbol, it was a profound responsibility. She knew that the course of Egypt's future would be determined by the guidance she offered Senusret. As the boy grew, so too would the weight of her influence. It was not just her husband who needed her wisdom, it was her son who would need her most. In the months that followed Senusret's birth, Nefret found herself balancing the demands of court life with the responsibilities of motherhood. She continued to advise her husband on matters of governance, often sitting in on meetings with generals, advisors, and scribes. Yet, with each passing day, she began to realize that her true focus now lay on her son. Senusret, despite his tender age, displayed a quiet intelligence that made Nefret believe that he would one day be more than just a figurehead on a throne. He had the potential to be a ruler in his own right, one who could lead Egypt through the challenges of the future. The palace was abuzz with activity as Nefret and Amenemhat I prepared Senusret for the day when he would inherit the throne. It was a time of training, not just for the child, but for the entire kingdom. The pharaoh and his queen were meticulous in ensuring that Senusret received the finest education, one that would shape him into a ruler who could protect and expand the empire. Despite her pride in her son, Nefret was not blind to the challenges that lay ahead. The court was rife with political tension, and not all nobles were pleased with the idea of Senusret taking the throne. There were whispers of old rivalries, of factions that sought to undermine the strength of Amenemhat I's reign. Nefret, aware of these dangers, took it upon herself to begin laying the groundwork for her son's future. She called upon her network of loyal supporters, those who had stood by Amenemhat I during his rise to power, and began forming alliances that would ensure Senusret's smooth ascension. In these early years, Nefret's influence in the court grew stronger. She was not just the mother of the heir to the throne, she was becoming the protector of the future of Egypt. As Senusret grew, so too did Nefret's influence. She was no longer simply the wife of the pharaoh. nor just the mother of a prince. She had become the most powerful woman in the court, a queen whose intelligence and cunning were unmatched. With every decision she made, she ensured the stability of Egypt and the future of her family. In the quiet moments, when Nefret would watch her son sleep, she often found herself reflecting on the path that lay ahead. The road would be difficult, there would be enemies to defeat, betrayals to navigate, and sacrifices to make, but she was ready. For Senusret, for Egypt, she would do whatever it took to see the dynasty of Amenemhat I endure for generations to come. And as she held her son in her arms, the future of Egypt seemed brighter than ever before. The legacy of the pharaohs would live on, and it would be through Senusret, her son, her hope, her legacy, that Egypt would rise to its full potential once again. The night in the royal palace was unusually quiet, save for the occasional rustle of the wind sweeping through the ancient stone corridors. Beneath the glow of flickering oil lamps, the palace was a place of secrets. Despite the grandeur of its halls, the walls were thick with unspoken tension. In the shadows, the wheels of intrigue turned, and power, like a snake, slithered quietly through the corridors of the court. Nefret could feel it. She had known the signs. The glances exchanged between nobles, the whispered conversations in dark corners of the royal chambers, the subtle shifts in loyalty. Something was stirring in the court. Amenemhat I had ruled Egypt with a steady hand, and though his reign had brought prosperity, not everyone within the palace shared his vision, and not everyone in the court was pleased with Nefret's growing influence. It was the nobles who had once supported Amenemhat I's rise, those who saw themselves as his rightful patrons, who now began to question his decisions. They resented the queen's prominent role in state affairs. Their envy festered beneath the surface, growing with every passing day. Some of them feared her intellect and the quiet, unwavering strength that radiated from her. To them, Nefret was not just a queen but a symbol of power beyond the pharaoh himself. Nefret was no fool. She had been trained in the ways of court politics from an early age. Her sharp mind had not only made her a beloved advisor to her husband but also a threat to those who sought to retain their influence at any cost. As the pharaoh's right hand, she had become the target of shadowy whispers and covert plots. There were those who saw her as an obstacle, one who stood in their way of claiming power. But Nefret would not be intimidated. She had been through too much already. She would not fall now. It began with small, almost imperceptible shifts, an awkward silence in the halls when she passed, the absence of familiar faces at court meetings, the sudden, unexplained absence of certain nobles who had once pledged loyalty to Amenemhat I. Nefret's intuition told her that something was wrong, and when her spies, trusted courtiers and servants loyal to her cause, began to report back strange rumors of a possible conspiracy, she knew the time had come to act. The nobles who had begun to conspire against her were not only interested in weakening her position, they aimed for far more. They sought to topple Amenemhat I's reign entirely and replace him with one of their own. These were not just petty political machinations, these were deep, dangerous plans that threatened the very stability of the kingdom. One evening, as Nefret sat in her private chambers, alone with her thoughts, her trusted attendant entered, breathless and urgent. "My queen," she said, kneeling before Nefret, "the conspirators, they moved tonight. They have made their first move against the pharaoh." Nefret's pulse quickened, but her face remained as calm as the still waters of the Nile. She had anticipated this moment, and now, it was upon her. The time for subtlety was over. "Where are they?" Nefret asked, her voice a quiet whisper. There was no panic in her tone, only resolve. "What do they plan?" "They have gathered at the eastern pavilion, near the northern gates. They plan to strike while the pharaoh sleeps, to take him when he is most vulnerable," the attendant replied, eyes wide with fear. Nefret's mind raced. If the conspiracy was to succeed, they would strike quickly and decisively. She couldn't afford to wait for reinforcements. She had to act alone, just as she had done many times before. Rising to her feet, she dismissed the attendant with a gesture. "Prepare my attire and summon the guard. We leave immediately." It was a moonless night, and the darkness of the desert seemed to encroach upon the palace itself. As Nefret moved through the corridors of the palace with quiet steps, she knew that this moment would shape the future of Egypt. Her husband, Amenemhat I, lay unaware of the plot against him, and her son, Senusret, slept soundly in his chambers. There was no time to waste. Nefret made her way to the eastern pavilion, the heart of the conspiracy. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long as she neared the gathering place of the conspirators. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the sharpness of purpose. This was no longer about saving herself, it was about protecting the future of Egypt. The conspirators were there, their figures cloaked in darkness. Huddled in whispered conversation, their leader, a man who had once been an ally to Amenemhat I, stood at the center, plotting the pharaoh's downfall. Nefret observed them from a distance, her mind working quickly to formulate her plan. She had to act decisively, there was no room for hesitation. With a flick of her hand, she signaled to her most loyal guards, who had followed her silently through the shadows. In an instant, they surrounded the conspirators, weapons drawn. The leader of the plot turned, startled, and his eyes widened in disbelief as he saw Nefret standing before him. Calm and unflinching, "You betray the pharaoh and the kingdom for your own ambition." Nefret's voice rang out in the stillness of the night. "But you have underestimated me. And more importantly, you have underestimated Egypt's will to survive." The conspirators moved to draw their weapons. But Nefret was faster. With a precise and controlled motion, she gave the order, and her guards swiftly disarmed the plotters, binding them in silence. Nefret approached the leader, her gaze cold but unwavering. "You will not succeed. Amenemhat I is the ruler of this land, and no treachery will undo what has been built," she declared. Her voice was not one of rage but of quiet authority. The conspirator, now bound and on his knees, looked up at her with a mixture of fear and admiration. You will never escape the truth," he spat, his words dripping with venom. But Nefret's eyes were as hard as the stone walls that surrounded them. "The truth is that Egypt will remain strong, as long as those who love her are willing to fight for her." By the time dawn broke over the horizon, the conspirators had been secured, and their plot was exposed to the full council of the court. The betrayal had been swift and dangerous, but Nefret's quick thinking had saved her husband and the kingdom from disaster. Amenemhat I, once awakened to the news, was both grateful and deeply moved by his wife's actions. He had always known that Nefret was intelligent and capable, but this act of courage solidified her place as not only his queen but as the true protector of Egypt's future. Nefret, however, did not bask in the praise. She knew that this victory was but one battle in a much larger war. The conspiracy had been rooted deeply within the court, and more enemies lurked in the shadows. But Nefret had proven that she was a force to be reckoned with, and anyone who sought to harm her family or her kingdom would soon learn that there was no place for treachery in her Egypt. The royal palace was unusually silent as dawn approached. The usual bustle of servants, guards, and courtiers had been replaced by an eerie stillness, broken only by the distant sounds of the wind rustling through the thick palm trees outside. The night had been long, filled with whispers of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed the kingdom. But now, as the first light of morning crept into the corridors, Nefret's mind was focused on something far more dangerous than courtly intrigue. An assassination attempt on Amenemhat I. It was a fear that had always lingered in the back of Nefret's mind. A shadowy threat she could not ignore. After the failed conspiracy, she knew that there were still those within the palace who would stop at nothing to see her husband dead and their own ambitions fulfilled. Despite their swift defeat the night before, the conspirators had not been the only ones harboring ill intentions. For weeks, Nefret had been receiving secret warnings from her most trusted allies, informants who had their ears to the ground. Watching the movements of certain factions within the court, the tension in the air was palpable. These whispered warnings had been enough to make Nefret wary. But this night, her instincts told her that danger was imminent. The court was quiet, the guards were lax, and the pharaoh had been unusually fatigued from his nightly duties. Nefret stood alone in the darkness of the royal chambers, her mind sharp and focused. Despite her position, despite her role as a queen, she had never allowed herself to become complacent. She knew that her greatest asset, her intellect, was also her greatest defense. And tonight, she would need every bit of it. Her husband, Amenemhat I, had retired early, exhausted from a full day of ruling Egypt. His health had been slipping recently, his strength waning in ways that even he could not hide. There was concern among his advisors, but none dared to speak the truth aloud. The pharaoh's time was running out. Whether from illness or the strain of his duties, Amenemhat I was not the young, invincible ruler he once was. The kingdom, already fragile from internal strife, needed stability more than ever. And yet, despite the fragility of the throne, there were forces at work, forces that believed the kingdom could be reshaped under a different ruler. Nefret had suspected that her husband's weakening health had made him a prime target. And as she stood at the window of their chambers, she watched the shadows move in the courtyard below. Minutes later, the silence was broken by the soft, urgent knock on the door. Nefret turned, her gaze steady as one of her most trusted guards entered, his face pale and tense. "My queen," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "An attempt is being made. They are already inside the palace." Nefret's heart quickened, but she did not flinch. She had prepared for this moment. "Gather the guards, keep your movements silent, and be swift," she ordered, her voice sharp and clear. "And send word to my son. I need him to be informed. Immediately." The guard hesitated for a moment, but Nefret's commanding presence dispelled any doubts. He nodded and left the room without a sound. Nefret moved quickly, her thoughts racing as she paced the chambers. The assassination attempt would not only threaten her husband's life, it would destabilize Egypt at a time when it could least afford it. If Amenemhat I were killed now, the throne would be left vulnerable. The conspirators, the nobles who had conspired before, would undoubtedly attempt to place a puppet ruler on the throne, someone they could control, someone who would bend to their will. She had no illusions about the lengths some would go to in order to claim power. Nefret knew she had to act fast, before it was too late. As she passed through the palace corridors, her mind was fixed on a singular goal: to protect her husband, to safeguard the future of Egypt, and to ensure that the line of Amenemhat I would not be broken. Amenemhat I lay sleeping in his chamber, unaware of the looming danger. The faint glow of moonlight spilled through the window, casting a pale light across the bed where the pharaoh rested, his body still and his breathing shallow. It was in this vulnerable moment that the assassins made their move. The sound of footfalls was muffled as they approached, masked by the heavy silence of the night. In the darkness of the pharaoh's chamber, a shadow moved toward his bed, silent, swift, and deadly. Nefret's heart pounded in her chest as she prepared to make her move. But just as the assassin raised his dagger, a figure emerged from the shadows. Without a sound, the assassin was brought to the floor, his weapon falling from his grasp as Nefret's guard struck him down with swift precision. Another assassin, hidden in the corner, tried to make a run for it, but he was intercepted by more guards, emerging from the dark like phantoms. In a matter of seconds, the threat was neutralized. Nefret stood in the doorway of the chamber, her expression hard and unwavering. Her mind had already begun to calculate the political ramifications of the attempted assassination. The conspirators had underestimated her. They had underestimated the pharaoh's strength, and they had certainly underestimated her own. Amenemhat I awoke to the sounds of the struggle, his eyes opening slowly to the sight of Nefret standing at the entrance. Her figure bathed in the faint moonlight. Her face was calm, but the steel in her gaze was unmistakable. "Nefret," he murmured, his voice hoarse with sleep. "What is this? What happened?" "An attempt on your life," she said, her voice even but laced with a hint of urgency. "It's over now. The conspirators are being dealt with." He sat up, rubbing his temples. "I knew it. The kingdom grows restless, and so do my enemies." Nefret moved toward him, her steps measured, yet there was a certain grace in the way she moved. She knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers. "You are not alone in this, Amenemhat. We will protect this kingdom together, but we must act quickly. The conspirators have moved more than just a dagger tonight. They have shown their true intentions." He nodded slowly, looking up at her with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "And what should we do next?" Nefret's gaze hardened. "We expose them. We root out every traitor. And we show the court that Egypt will not bend to anyone's will but ours." Amenemhat I, his strength slowly returning as he took in her words, nodded in agreement. "You are right, Nefret. Egypt needs us both. Together, we will make sure that the kingdom remains strong." With the immediate threat vanquished, Nefret knew the battle was far from over. The conspiracy was not just a few isolated traitors, it was a far-reaching network of enemies. Ones who would stop at nothing to see her family dethroned. But for now, the pharaoh was safe, the kingdom would remain intact. And in that brief moment of victory, Nefret understood more clearly than ever the role she had to play. This was no longer just about preserving her family, it was about protecting Egypt itself. The tension within the royal palace had not yet lifted. After the failed assassination attempt, Nefret knew that the kingdom's enemies had been given a glimpse of their own mortality. But the threat was far from over. The conspiracy that had nearly cost her husband's life was just one part of a larger, more insidious plot to destabilize the throne. But in that moment of danger, Nefret had seen something else. Something that made the heart of Egypt beat a little louder, the necessity of securing a future. A lasting legacy for the pharaoh and the kingdom itself. It was in the aftermath of the failed assassination that Amenemhat I began to turn his attention to a long gestating vision. One that would secure Egypt's future for generations to come. Nefret had been quietly advocating for the move even before the attempt on his life, urging her husband to look beyond the present moment of political instability. Now, more than ever, it seemed the right time to act. "I cannot rule Egypt from this palace alone," Amenemhat I said to her one evening, his voice heavy with the burden of his thoughts. "We need to fortify the heart of our kingdom. Give our reign a foundation that will withstand the test of time. I must build a new city. It will be our legacy." The idea was bold, audacious even. Egypt had thrived for centuries, with its capital in Thebes. But Amenemhat I saw that a new city, positioned centrally within the country, would solidify his rule and protect the kingdom from the dangers that constantly loomed at its borders. This would be a city of both political power and spiritual significance, a place where the throne could remain secure, far from the distractions and distractions of Thebes' vast power structures. Nefret's eyes gleamed with approval as she listened. Itoi, the new capital city, would be the center of governance, the base from which Egypt's future would be shaped. This was not just a city, but a statement of power. The mere thought of it sent ripples of excitement through her. And yet she knew that this ambitious plan would not come without its challenges. "The city must be built on the foundation of stability," she said quietly, her eyes meeting her husband's. "Itoi must not only serve as a symbol of power, but also as a place where the wealth and might of Egypt can be contained and protected. We must choose the location carefully, one that is easily defended, but also accessible to the entire kingdom." Amenemhat I nodded thoughtfully, admiring his wife's vision. He had always known that her intelligence was a rare gift, and now it was clear to him that Nefret was not just a wife, but a true partner in shaping the future of Egypt. The decision to build Itoi was made, and soon the entire court was abuzz with activity. Nefret and Amenemhat I worked together, carefully choosing the site for the new capital. The city would be built near the strategic site of the Pharaoh Oasis, a place that allowed easy access to the Nile, offering fertile lands for agriculture and ample resources for trade. It was a place that symbolized both life and power. Nefret took charge of the planning, overseeing the construction of the city with meticulous attention to detail, while Amenemhat I focused on securing alliances with neighboring kingdoms and consolidating military strength. Nefret worked tirelessly behind the scenes, ensuring that the infrastructure of Itoi would be nothing short of grand. The work was grueling. Builders and artisans were brought from all corners of Egypt to create the new capital. The plans for grand temples, palaces, and administrative buildings were drawn up, with Nefret ensuring that the city would be as efficient as it was majestic. She knew that every stone laid, every pillar erected, would serve as a testament to the strength of her family, and a statement to any who would dare challenge their power. Itoi would be a city of order and stability, but also a city that represented a new era, one that Nefret and Amenemhat I were determined to create. It would be a place where the king's authority would be unchallenged, and where the royal family could rule Egypt from a position of strength. As the construction of Itoi progressed, Nefret's role in the court continued to grow. Her decisions regarding the design of the city reflected her deep understanding of both political and spiritual matters. She insisted that the temples in the city be dedicated to the gods who protected Egypt's sovereignty, emphasizing the connection between the divine and the earthly power of the pharaoh. She also advocated for the careful placement of government buildings and royal residences, ensuring that the city's layout was both symbolic and strategic. Itui would be the heart of Egypt's power, a central location that would provide security for the pharaoh and his family, while also serving as a beacon of Egypt's strength and unity. But Nefret's influence in the court was not without its detractors. There were those who viewed her growing power with distrust, particularly among the more traditional factions in Thebes. The nobility, who had long held sway over the pharaoh's decisions, were beginning to question her influence, and some began to whisper that she was steering her husband's reign in directions that were too radical. Nefret was not blind to these murmurs. She had grown accustomed to navigating the complex web of court politics, and she knew that any power shift would create friction. The nobles who had supported Amenemhat I's rise now began to fear the changes he was making. Itui, they said, was a direct challenge to the old order, a reminder that the pharaoh was no longer beholden to the structures of the past. But Nefret remained unfazed. She had learned long ago that true power did not lie in appeasing the old guard. It lay in the ability to shape the future. And Itui was the key to that future. As the city took shape, so too did Nefret's vision for Egypt's future. The construction of Itui was not just a project of buildings and walls, it was a project of the mind. Nefret understood that the kingdom needed more than just physical security, it needed unity. And in Itui, she would build that unity. The queen often visited the construction site, overseeing the work and offering guidance where necessary. She would walk the streets of the city, imagining what it would one day be, a bustling hub of trade and politics, where Egypt's future would be decided. She would see the foundations of the great temples rising from the earth, knowing that these sacred spaces would ensure the continued favor of the gods. But as much as Nefret loved her work, she knew that the challenges were far from over. There would be more enemies to confront, more schemes to thwart, and more political games to play. But in that moment, as she stood on the dusty ground of Itui, watching the city come to life before her eyes, she could not help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Itui was more than just a city, it was the future. It was Egypt's future. And with every brick laid, every stone placed, Nefret knew that her legacy, and that of her family, would endure. Itui, the new capital of Egypt, was growing rapidly, its streets alive with the hum of construction and commerce. The sound of hammers striking stone and the rhythm of builders laying the foundation for Egypt's future filled the air. Nefret often found herself walking through the bustling streets, watching as the city of her dreams began to take shape. The tall stone columns of temples and the massive walls of royal palaces rose higher each day, a testament to the vision that she and Amenemhat I had set into motion. But beneath the bustling activity, Nefret knew that Egypt's future was not just being built from bricks and mortar. It was being shaped in the chambers of power, where every decision made would determine the kingdom's survival. And here, in the heart of Itui, Nefret was not just the queen, she was a counselor, an advisor, and a woman whose intelligence and political acumen were now regarded as equal to that of any man in the court. Her influence within the royal palace had reached new heights, and Amenemhat I had come to rely more and more on her counsel. What started as quiet suggestions over matters of governance had grown into formal consultations, where Nefret's voice was heard alongside the most powerful men in Egypt. Her role was no longer just a ceremonial one, she had become an essential part of the decision-making process. Yet, with her rise in influence came an equal rise in opposition. Not all in the court were pleased with Nefret's growing power. The more traditional factions within the nobility, those who had once whispered of her too close involvement with her husband, now openly questioned her place at the table. They saw her influence as a challenge to the old order, and some began to voice their concerns more loudly. Do you truly believe the kingdom will prosper if we allow a woman to dictate the future of Egypt? One of the older counselors had asked Amenemhat I, his voice laced with contempt. We have always been a kingdom ruled by men. But Amenemhat I, now wiser and more reliant on his wife's counsel, had dismissed these objections. My queen's wisdom has guided us thus far, he had said firmly. Her vision is as sharp as any man's, and the future of Egypt will be built on the strength of our unity, not on outdated traditions. Despite the support of her husband, Nefret could feel the weight of those who opposed her growing stronger. The murmurs of discontent were more frequent, and the whispers of her increasing power filled the corners of the royal court like smoke that could not be dispelled. She was not naive. She knew that the court's factions were not so easily silenced. One evening, as Nefret sat at her desk, reviewing a series of petitions from the provinces, she received word that an important meeting of the council was to be held in the Great Hall of the palace. This meeting was to discuss Egypt's military strategy in the wake of increasing tensions along its northern borders. Nefret knew this would be another test of her influence. The pharaoh's military commanders and the leading nobles of Egypt would be in attendance. These were men who had fought in the campaigns that had secured Egypt's borders and expanded its influence. They were seasoned warriors, loyal to Amenemhat I, but they were also men who resented any encroachment on their authority. Nefret had been present at previous military meetings, offering suggestions on strategy and diplomacy. But this time, it would be different. The stakes were higher, and the pressure would be immense. She arrived at the meeting hall before the others, her gown flowing around her as she entered the room. The men who had gathered, generals, nobles, and high-ranking officials, looked up as she entered. For a moment, there was a tense silence, as if the very presence of a woman in their midst was an affront to their sensibilities. Nefret ignored the looks and moved to her place at the table, beside her husband, who sat at the head of the council. He gave her a warm, reassuring smile, but she could feel the eyes of the room on her, calculating, evaluating. The discussions began in earnest, with the generals outlining the military strategies to defend Egypt's northern borders against the growing threat of the Hyksos. Nefret listened intently, her sharp mind absorbing every word. She could see the gaps in their plans, the weaknesses they had not yet addressed. She had spent countless hours studying military strategy, learning from the best minds in Egypt, absorbing the lessons of past campaigns, and now, it was her time to speak. When the conversation began to slow, Nefret cleared her throat and raised her voice. Calm but commanding. "If I may," she said, her eyes meeting the generals, who looked at her with a mix of surprise and disdain. "The strategy you propose is sound, but I believe we have overlooked the key element that will ensure our success: the role of diplomacy in military affairs. The Hyksos are not just a military threat, they are a political one. We cannot simply rely on our soldiers to win this war. We must ensure that our allies remain loyal and that our enemies are divided." There was a brief silence. The generals exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond to a woman who dared to speak of strategy in terms of diplomacy and political alliances. "If we focus solely on military might, we risk leaving Egypt vulnerable to further division within our own ranks." Nefret continued, her voice unwavering. "I suggest that we strengthen our alliances with neighboring kingdoms, particularly with the Nubians and the Libyans, while also ensuring that we cut off the Hyksos' support from any foreign traders who may be supplying them." The council fell into murmurs of discontent. Some nodded, intrigued by the idea of combining military might with diplomacy. But others scoffed at the very notion of a woman offering advice on matters of war. Amenemhat I, however, stood by her, his voice clear and resolute. "The queen speaks the truth. We have the power to defeat the Hyksos, but we must not be blinded by pride. We need allies, and we must act swiftly to ensure that Egypt is not isolated." The generals, though clearly uncomfortable, grudgingly agreed. The council continued its deliberations, but the direction had already shifted. The seed of diplomacy had been planted, and the generals began to realize the wisdom of Nefret's words. By the end of the meeting, a new strategy had been devised, one that would combine military action with a network of diplomatic alliances, an approach that had not been considered before. That evening, as the council adjourned, Nefret felt a quiet sense of victory. The path forward for Egypt had been secured, and her influence had been strengthened once again. But as she walked alongside her husband through the palace, she knew that the struggle was far from over. There would always be those who resented her role, who would seek to undermine her at every turn. "Do you think they will ever truly accept me?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with a mix of hope and weariness. Amenemhat I looked at her, his eyes filled with admiration. "They will, my queen. They have no choice but to see what you've brought to Egypt. Your wisdom is undeniable, and your strength is unmatched." Nefret smiled softly, but there was a hardness in her gaze. "I hope you're right, but if they do not accept me, Then they will learn to respect me." The years that followed the construction of Itoi were both prosperous and turbulent for Egypt. The city, now thriving at the heart of the kingdom, stood as a symbol of the pharaoh's reign and the vision of Nefret. The kingdom's borders were secured, and Egypt's political influence spread across the region. Yet, beneath this veneer of stability, an undercurrent of uncertainty began to rise within the royal palace itself. Amenemhat I, despite his formidable will and vision, had grown weaker with time. His once unshakable strength was slowly diminishing, and his health began to fail. His advisors, his generals, and his queen, all could see it, but none dared to speak of it aloud. The pharaoh, after all, was the living embodiment of Egypt itself. To discuss his mortality was to acknowledge the possibility of Egypt's vulnerability. It was in the quiet chambers of the royal palace that Nefret began to see the true depth of the crisis that loomed. The future of Egypt, her family's future, was in question. And the uncertainty that gripped Amenemhat I's reign now extended to the very heart of the kingdom. The whispers began subtly, like a soft breeze that one might ignore. But Nefret could not afford to. Who will succeed him? The nobles began to ask. Though never in front of the pharaoh. Always behind closed doors. The royal court was rife with speculation. Amenemhat I had one son, Senusret I, but the young prince had not yet fully demonstrated his ability to rule. He was still in his youth, inexperienced, and the kingdom needed a ruler who could command immediate respect. It was a harsh truth that Nefret knew all too well. Senusret was brilliant, yes, but the crown was heavy, and those who would seek to seize power were already plotting their moves. Nefret had raised Senusret with a careful balance of love and discipline. She had taught him the ways of governance, strategy, and diplomacy, preparing him for the day when he would ascend to the throne. Yet, even with all her preparation, she knew that the young prince was still untested. He had not yet faced the trials of leadership, nor had he learned the subtle arts of court politics that could make or break a ruler. One evening, as the first light of the moon began to seep through the windows of the royal chambers, Nefret sat alone, her thoughts consumed by the growing uncertainty surrounding her husband's health. Amenemhat I had retired to his bed early that night, exhausted from another long day of state matters, and Nefret was left to contemplate the future of Egypt. The silence was broken by a soft knock at the door. Nefret rose to open it, and in stepped her most trusted confidant, a young nobleman who had served her for many years. "My queen," the young man began, his face troubled. "There are those in the court who have begun to speak openly of the succession. They question whether Senusret I's truly ready to take the throne." Nefret's heart clenched. She had feared this moment, but now that it had arrived, it was no longer something she could ignore. "They do not believe in his strength," she replied, her voice cold and measured. "They believe he is too young, too inexperienced." The nobleman nodded, his gaze flickering nervously. "They are seeking another heir, a stronger candidate. Some say the military commanders may even support a rival, someone from outside the immediate royal family." A cold chill ran down Nefret's spine. The court, once loyal to the throne, was now ripe with divisions. The old nobles, who had seen their power wane under Amenemhat I's reforms, now saw an opportunity to regain control. Their eyes were on the throne, their ambitions sharpening like daggers. Nefret knew that she had to act swiftly, but the task before her was daunting. The royal succession was not just a matter of family, it was a matter of power, loyalty, and control. The fate of Egypt itself hung in the balance, and the court would not allow any weakness to go unnoticed. If Senusret was to ascend to the throne, he would need more than just his mother's love and guidance. He would need to prove himself worthy in the eyes of those who ruled Egypt from the shadows. The next few days passed in a blur of private meetings, tense discussions, and careful maneuvering. Nefret did not trust the nobles who had begun to question Senusret's abilities. She knew that if they were allowed to gather too much support, they would fracture the unity of the kingdom and place Egypt's future in jeopardy. One night, after a long day of courtly affairs, Nefret took Senusret aside. The young prince had grown tall and strong, and his once boyish features were now beginning to show the first signs of maturity. Yet, as she looked into his eyes, she could still see the uncertainty that lingered there, the uncertainty of a man not yet ready to face the burdens of kingship. Senusret, Nefret began, her voice soft but firm. There are those in the court who question your ability to rule. They believe that you are not ready for the throne. They will attempt to weaken your position. Senusret looked at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. But I've been trained for this. Mother, you have prepared me for this day. She smiled, a faint, sad smile, knowing that even the best training could not prepare him for the dangerous world of court politics. You have been prepared, yes, but you must now show the court that you are ready to lead. You must prove yourself not just to them, but to yourself. Senusret nodded, though the weight of the task before him was heavy on his shoulders. What must I do, mother? Nefret placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady and filled with quiet resolve. You must take control. You must earn the respect of the nobles, of the military commanders. You must show them that you are not a child who will simply follow in his father's footsteps, but a man who can forge his own path. The time for doubt has passed. Senusret, you must become the ruler Egypt needs. Over the following weeks, Senusret began to take a more active role in the affairs of state. Nefret guided him, offering her counsel on military strategy, diplomacy, and governance. Together, they began to counter the whispers of opposition within the court. Senusret's leadership skills, once thought to be untested, now began to shine through. He spoke with conviction in the council meetings, offering his own ideas for Egypt's future, ideas that would further strengthen the kingdom. But as the tension in the court escalated, so did the threats to their family. Nefret knew that the true test was yet to come. The nobles, although momentarily subdued by Senusret's emerging authority, would not relinquish their grip on power so easily. It was only a matter of time before the opposition made their move. For Nefret, the battle for Egypt's future was just beginning, and as the crisis of succession unfolded, she was prepared to fight for her family, and for the kingdom she had helped to build. The days in Italy grew long, the heat of the Egyptian sun relentless as summer bled into the autumn months. The once thriving city now stood as a testament to the vision of the pharaoh and the queen. Yet, in the quiet chambers of the royal palace, the shadows of a different kind of future began to stretch long over the kingdom. The most unspoken, yet most inevitable, truth had taken root. Pharaoh Amenemhat I's health had deteriorated beyond repair. Despite the advancements in medicine and the countless attempts by his physicians, Amenemhat I had grown weaker with each passing day. His once commanding presence was now a mere shadow of its former self. The signs of his decline had been subtle at first, the occasional cough, the unsteady gait, but now, his frailty was undeniable. The pharaoh, a man who had once walked with the strength of a lion, now lay in bed, his vitality slipping like sand through an hourglass. Nefret, who had been by his side through the trials and triumphs of his reign, stood vigil beside her husband's bedside, her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. She had always known that the path to power was fraught with peril, but nothing could prepare her for the raw grief of seeing the man she loved, the man who had built Egypt into the powerful empire it was, now fading before her eyes. Her thoughts often drifted to their son. Senusret, the young prince, despite his rising strength, was still not ready to face the throne alone. Though Nefret had prepared him in every way she knew how, the weight of kingship was heavy, and the transition would be tumultuous. The kingdom was fragile, and those who would seek to tear it down had already begun to make their moves. On the evening that Amenemhat I passed from this world, the air was thick with tension. The silence that had pervaded the palace for weeks now seemed to stretch unbearably long. Nefret sat at the edge of the pharaoh's bed, her hand gently holding his. The sounds of distant prayers could be heard, the chants of the high priests hoping to ease the pharaoh's soul into the afterlife. With a final, shuddering breath, Amenemhat I exhaled, the weight of his reign lifted, and the kingdom stood still. Nefret's heart felt as if it had stopped with him. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to grieve in silence. But even in her grief, there was no time for weakness. The kingdom needed her strength now more than ever. Senusret entered the room, his youthful face filled with sorrow. Yet his posture, though shaken, remained strong. The young prince, now the heir to the throne, knelt beside his father's bed, his hand placed gently on his shoulder. His gaze, though filled with sadness, was also one of resolve. He understood what this moment meant, and he knew that the time had come for him to step into his father's shoes. No matter how ill-prepared he felt. Nefret placed a hand on Senusret's shoulder. Her touch firm, yet comforting. "Senusret," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father has gone, but you must carry on. Egypt will look to you now. And you must lead. We have prepared for this day. Now, you must be the ruler this kingdom needs." Senusret nodded, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. But his voice was steady. "I will do what is necessary. Mother. For Egypt, and for father." The following days were filled with the rituals of mourning. The pharaoh's body was prepared for burial, and the royal court was swept into a flurry of activity as officials made arrangements for the coronation of Senusret I. The nobles, generals, and priests gathered to witness the transition of power. Though many had already begun to question whether the young prince would be able to live up to the legacy of his father. The palace, once a place of confident decisions, now seemed fraught with uncertainty. Nefret knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Egypt, though mighty, was on the precipice of a dangerous shift. There were factions within the court, both old and new, who would seek to take advantage of the power vacuum left by Amenemhat I's death. The nobles who had once been sidelined during Amenemhat I's reign would now look to increase their influence. And there were whispers that even the military commanders might have their own plans for the throne. Nefret was not blind to these threats. The moment Senusret was crowned pharaoh, the real battle for Egypt's future would begin. And in that moment, Nefret knew that she would have to fight as fiercely as ever to protect her son and the kingdom her husband had worked so hard to build. The day of Amenemhat I's funeral arrived, and the entire kingdom seemed to mourn. The streets of Italy were quiet, draped in black cloth as the people paid their respects to the great pharaoh. The procession was long, the air heavy with the scent of incense and the distant sound of drums. Nefret walked behind her husband's casket, her head held high, her face a mask of calm. Inside, however, her heart was breaking. As the funeral rites were performed, Senusret stood beside his mother, the weight of the crown pressing down on him even though it was not yet placed upon his head. His heart was heavy with grief for his father, but he knew that the time for mourning would be brief. He could already feel the pressure mounting, the expectations of the court weighing on him. It was not enough to be the son of Amenemhat I. He had to prove himself worthy of the throne. Later that evening, in the quiet solitude of the palace, Nefret stood alone in her chambers, contemplating the future. Senusret would be crowned the next day. The kingdom would rally behind him, but only if he proved himself capable. Nefret knew her role was far from over. She had spent years preparing her son for this moment, but the true test of his strength was yet to come. She thought back to her own journey, how she had navigated the dangerous currents of court politics, how she had fought to protect her family and her kingdom. And now, it was Senusret's turn. He would need to walk a similar path. Surrounded by allies, yes, but also enemies. The battle for power was never truly over. It would only change form. Nefret glanced at the city of Italy from her window, the lights of the new capital twinkling in the distance. Egypt's future lay before her son. It was not only his legacy now, it was her own. And she would do everything in her power to ensure that Egypt, and Senusret, would rise to meet the challenges ahead. The day of Amenemhat I's funeral passed in a haze of rituals and prayers. And the entire kingdom felt the weight of loss. The streets of Italy were filled with mourners, the people of Egypt offering their respects to the pharaoh who had brought them prosperity. Yet beneath the mournful atmosphere, there was an unspoken sense of anticipation. The crown had not yet been placed on Senusret's head, and Egypt waited for its new king to rise. It was in the early morning hours, as the sun began to creep above the horizon, that Senusret was finally crowned pharaoh of Egypt. The coronation ceremony was grand, held in the great temple at the heart of Italy, where the gods were called upon to bless the new ruler. Nefret stood beside her son, her hand resting lightly on his arm as the high priest raised the crown above his head. The weight of the crown was more than just physical, it symbolized a lifetime of responsibility. The expectations of an entire nation. Senusret's face remained calm, though his heart raced beneath the ceremonial robes. He was not a child anymore, not the boy who had trained in the royal halls under his mother's watchful eye. But standing there in the temple, surrounded by priests, nobles, and soldiers. He could feel the gravity of the moment pressing down on him. This was no longer just a ceremony, it was the beginning of his reign. It was his time to prove himself, to show the court, the people, and the world that he was capable of leading Egypt. As the high priest placed the crown on Senusret's head, a cheer rose from the gathered crowd. The gods had witnessed the transition, and now Egypt had a new pharaoh. Nefret's heart swelled with pride, but also with anxiety. Her son had ascended to the throne. But this was only the beginning. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead. As the balance of power in the court shifted, and new challenges arose, the royal court shifted into high gear immediately after the coronation. The nobles, generals, and priests began to line up before the new pharaoh, each offering their allegiance. It was a moment of great formality. But Nefret could sense the undercurrent of tension. She could see the way certain generals held themselves back, their eyes wary, calculating. Not all were content with Senusret's ascension. Nefret stood behind her son, watching carefully as the men who had once sworn loyalty to Amenemhat I now shifted their loyalties. Cautiously eyeing the young pharaoh, they had pledged their allegiance. Yes, but the true test would come when Senusret had to prove himself through action. His decisions would speak louder than any oath or promise. The first challenge came swiftly. Senusret had barely settled into the royal seat before the murmurs of discontent began to grow. Word reached him quickly of a growing faction among the military commanders. They were not fully supportive of his reign, uncertain of his capabilities and wary of his youth. The Hyksos, who had been pressing against Egypt's northern borders, were becoming more aggressive, and some in the military feared that Senusret might not be able to handle the impending threat. The generals who had once fought alongside Amenemhat I were now questioning whether the new pharaoh could protect Egypt's future. As the days wore on, Senusret's anxiety deepened. He had been groomed for this moment, trained by his mother, but nothing could truly prepare him for the weight of kingship. He had witnessed his father's leadership, admired his wisdom and strength, but now it was his turn. Could he live up to the legacy of Amenemhat I? Would he be able to unite the court and maintain the kingdom's stability? Nefret, ever the tactician, saw the growing unease in her son. She knew he needed more than just words of encouragement, he needed action. And quickly. Senusret, she said, one evening as they sat together in the royal chambers. You must not hesitate. The time for doubt is over. The generals and nobles are watching you. They need to see your strength, your resolve. You must show them that you are not simply your father's heir, but a ruler in your own right. Senusret looked at her, his face troubled. I fear I am not ready. Mother, the weight of the crown, it's heavy. You are more ready than you realize. Nefret replied softly, but with unshakable conviction. You are a reflection of your father's strength and wisdom. But you must make your own path. Show them that you are capable of leading, of making difficult decisions. And show them that Egypt's future is in capable hands. The very next day, the opportunity for Senusret to prove his leadership came sooner than expected. A delegation of northern generals arrived at the palace, bringing word of an imminent attack from the Hyksos. The reports were grim. The Hyksos had amassed a significant force near the borders, and they were threatening to invade Egypt's territory. Senusret knew that this would be the moment that would define his reign. He could not afford to delay or hesitate. The generals, though loyal, were still uncertain about his ability to lead them into battle. He had to make them believe in his strength and strategy. With his mother's words echoing in his mind, Senusret stood before the generals, his posture firm and commanding. He addressed the court with authority, outlining his plan to secure Egypt's borders and rally the military forces to defend the kingdom. It was a bold strategy, one that combined swift military action with diplomatic outreach to their allies, ensuring that Egypt would not face this threat alone. We will not be divided by fear, Senusret declared, his voice steady and powerful. We will stand united, as Egypt always has. We will strike back with strength. And we will ensure that the Hyksos know that Egypt is not a kingdom to be taken lightly. The generals exchanged looks, nodding in agreement. For the first time since his father's death, Senusret saw respect in their eyes. The young pharaoh had proven his decisiveness, his ability to lead. He had shown them that he was more than just the son of Amenemhat I. He was a ruler in his own right. The days that followed were tense, but Senusret's strategy worked. The military quickly mobilized, And with Nefret's guidance, diplomatic channels were opened to secure Egypt's allies. The Hyksos were driven back, and the kingdom's borders remained secure. It was a victory, not just for Egypt, but for Senusret himself. Nefret stood quietly in the background, watching her son as he walked through the palace halls. His head held high. He had taken the first step toward proving himself as pharaoh, and the court, once filled with doubt, now began to rally behind him. Senusret had risen to the occasion, and in doing so, he had solidified his place as Egypt's ruler. That evening, as the stars began to fill the sky, Nefret and Senusret sat together in the royal gardens. The weight of the day's events had lifted from his shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, Senusret seemed at peace. "You did it, Senusret," Nefret said softly, her eyes filled with pride. "You showed them your strength. You have proven that you are ready." Senusret turned to her, his expression one of quiet determination. "I have taken the first step, mother, but I know the road ahead will not be easy. I will need your guidance. Now more than ever." "You have it, always," Nefret replied, her voice steady. "I will always stand by your side. Together, we will make sure Egypt thrives." As the night deepened, Nefret knew that the real work was only just beginning. Senusret had shown the court and the kingdom that he was ready to lead. But there were still many challenges to face. Egypt's enemies had not been silenced, and the factions within the court would continue to test him. But for now, Nefret allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that her son had proven himself worthy of the throne. The future of Egypt was in capable hands. The days of uncertainty had passed, and Egypt stood once again on firm ground. Senusret I, now fully embracing his role as pharaoh, had solidified his reign through a series of bold and decisive actions. The Hyksos had been pushed back, alliances had been secured, and the kingdom had returned to its former glory. The court, once filled with whispers of doubt, now rallied behind their king, and the people of Egypt looked to the future with hope. But even in the midst of prosperity, Nefret could feel the weight of time pressing against her. Her husband, Amenemhat I, had passed, and her son had ascended to the throne. Her work, it seemed, was done, yet she knew that her legacy, her contributions to the kingdom, would endure for as long as Egypt remained strong. As Pharaoh Senusret I began to focus on expanding Egypt's influence beyond its borders, Nefret knew that her role would slowly shift from active participation in court affairs to a quieter presence, one of wisdom and guidance. She had spent years shaping the future of Egypt, and now it was time for the next generation to take the reins. Her heart swelled with pride as she watched Senusret, once uncertain and young, now standing as a ruler of immense capability. In the quiet moments of reflection, Nefret often found herself alone in the royal gardens of Italy, gazing out over the land she had helped to build. The city, a symbol of her husband's vision and her own influence, had flourished. Italy was the beating heart of Egypt, a place where the legacy of Amenemhat I and Nefret would live on, shaping the future of the kingdom for generations to come. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the towering structures of the city, Senusret joined her in the gardens. He was no longer the uncertain prince she had once known. He was a pharaoh in every sense of the word, a ruler of strength and wisdom. "Mother," Senusret said softly, his voice filled with both reverence and love, "I will never be able to repay you for all you have done, for the wisdom, the guidance, and the strength you have shown me. You have helped me become the ruler I am today." Nefret smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "You have always had the strength within you, Senusret. I simply helped you find it. The kingdom needed you, and you rose to the challenge. Egypt will thrive under your leadership." Senusret knelt before her, his expression full of gratitude. "I know that my reign will be remembered, but it is your legacy that has shaped Egypt's future. You were not just my mother, Nefret. You were the queen who helped build Egypt into the powerful kingdom it is. You are a part of its very soul." For a moment, Nefret was silent, her heart touched by her son's words. She had always known that her role as a mother and queen was important. But in this moment, she saw the full impact of her life's work. Egypt, with all its grandeur and strength, would carry her legacy forward, and she would rest easy, knowing that the kingdom was in good hands. In the years that followed, Nefret watched as her son's reign flourished. Senusret I expanded Egypt's borders, building diplomatic alliances and securing Egypt's position as a dominant power in the ancient world. The military, the economy, and the arts all thrived under his leadership. Yet, despite the successes, Senusret always remembered the foundation upon which his reign was built: his mother's guidance, his father's vision, and the unity that Nefret had brought to Egypt. As for Nefret herself, she withdrew from the court's politics, content to advise when needed but mostly watching from the shadows. Her role as a mother and a queen had come to an end. But she knew that her legacy was more than just her actions. It was the legacy of the future she had helped shape, the kingdom she had helped build, and the family she had nurtured. One fateful evening, as the years began to weigh on her, Nefret walked through the royal palace one last time. The halls, now familiar and beloved to her, seemed quieter than they had before. The bustling energy of the court had slowed, and in the distance, she could hear the soft echoes of a new generation stepping into their roles. She had seen Egypt through its darkest hours, and now she could see it standing tall, poised to conquer whatever challenges the future might bring. As Nefret stood before the grand window of her chambers, overlooking the city of Itui, she felt a quiet peace settle within her. The legacy of Amenemhat I had endured, and Egypt stood proud, its future secure. She had given everything to this kingdom, to her family, and to the people who depended on her. Now, her work was complete. With a final glance at the kingdom she had helped build, Nefret closed her eyes, knowing that Egypt's story would continue long after her own. The gods had blessed her life, and in their hands, her legacy would live on for eternity.